All right. Everyone hear me okay? All right. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about soil health today and building soils, which was a concept in the first half of my career that I didn't really realize could even be done. And so consequently, I usually tell groups I kind of wasted the first half of my career treating symptoms, symptom after symptom after symptom, but rarely got to the real problem itself. And the second half of my career, I am trying much harder to work on the problem. And consequently, that's a whole different scenario. And I'm hoping between the two halves of my career that they'll average out. And so that'll be an average career at the end. But to start with this, I want to do a slake that shows what I would call a soil with probably what I would think of in terms of more an original landscape. Shall we say a pre-European farming landscape? Okay, so before European agriculture was introduced to North Dakota, and at that time, what did we have? We had high plant diversity, and there were some journals written 200 plus years ago that described that pretty well. And we had large animals, small animals. We had a lot of animals on the landscape as well, and predators, and somewhat of a sustainable ecosystem that built our mollisol soils that we have today. And they, of course, have played out very well for production agriculture in this state. Mollisols meaning they were prairie formed, okay? Because it's the fibrous root mass that actually builds soils. So if you take a look at this soil, and you're sitting close, and I know you hid your name, but you have to, okay. Sanda? Sanda. Okay, should we go to someone else? Okay, I just want you to describe what you see. These are two loam soils, okay? But they look a little different, all right? Describe what you see. What do you see on this one versus this one?
I see something that's smooth. There seems to be more soil and more. This the great.
Okay, this one, they're both loams. Okay, this one is more smooth. Okay, this one, would you agree, is kind of bumpier looking, maybe a little more cottage cheese looking. Okay, do you also see something on this one that you don't see over here? So we have some plant roots on this one. Okay, not so much on this one. Okay, so now let me give you a little bit of background on these two soil PEDs. When I was a kid growing up with my sisters, they were clods, but now they're PEDs. Okay, but this particular one here has full diversity. So in other words, all four major crop types: cool season grass, warm season grass, cool season broadleaves, warm season broadleaves. Okay, so full diversity. Right. This one also has livestock integration. Okay, so there's livestock integration as well, grazing. Okay. This one also has had some past history of cover crops. Okay, and very minimal soil disturbance. Okay, so very minimal soil disturbance. This one has had pretty much the opposite. Okay, this one has had basically a monoculture growing on it for the past probably 10 years, maybe a little more. No cover crops, no livestock integration. Okay, so no grazing of livestock on it either. And it has pretty intensive soil disturbance or tillage on it each and every year. So what we're going to do is we're going to put these two PEDs in the water. Okay, the water is going to come into the PED, right? And how's the water going to get in? How's the water going to get into those PEDs? Yeah, the air spaces, the pore spaces. Soils are in a typical soil should be about 50% pore space. Okay, and in that 50%, that should be about half air and half water, approximately. Okay, and then we're 45% sand, silt, and clay, and we're about 5%, which is really good, but for today's easy math, we'll say 5% soil organic matter. There's your 100% of what the soil is. Okay, so the water, Dave's right, the water is going to come in through the pore spaces, and it's going to create a pressure. Okay, when the water comes in, it'll create an internal pressure. If the pressure overrides the glues, and the glues are made by the soil fungi and the plant together, that's how the glues are made that hold our soils together. If the glues are adequate, it'll stay together, okay? And it'll just kind of sit there and look at you, okay? If the glues aren't adequate, it will slake off. And the reason I wanted a cylinder with some vertical height to it, so you could actually see the slaking, okay? Maybe they're both going to be really healthy and we won't have any slaking. And I'll have to go to plan B, okay? But we got some extremes here in management. Now another item that's real apparent on these two, hope I don't drop them, is color. You notice one is a little darker than the other, okay? What's the color? If you have a tote bag full of elemental carbon, what color is it? It's black, yeah. I had a brother-in-law manage the 3M plant at Omaha for many years, and he would take me on a tour of the plant, and we'd look at all these tote bag fulls of carbon that were used in the making of their products, okay? When we bring more carbon into the soil than what is leaving, our soils get darker. When we have more carbon leaving than what's coming into our soils, they get lighter, okay? So we can tell a lot by color. We can tell by root mass. We can also tell by the more it looks like cottage cheese, that's a good indicator as well. You want kind of a cottage cheese look to it. So we got all kinds of Burley County people today. Okay, so we're going to put these in. Now you have to help me put them in also. Okay. Now we've got a couple of meshes here, and I like to take the bottoms out of them because I want the ped to be stressed. Okay, I don't want it coddled and held in place. I want it to be stressed. So on both of these, you can see we have the bottoms kind of somewhat cut out of them. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to set them in there, and we'll set them in there about at the same time, and then the water will try to come in. What should we see bubble to the top? We should see that oxygen that's in those pore spaces, right? So we should see some of that, okay? If we don't, that's not necessarily a good sign. Then we went rather anaerobic. So let's start with this. Okay. Now you can't stay up here. You have to sit down. Okay. I know where you were going. Okay, now we're going to build some pressure. We can see the bubbles starting to come to the top, so the pore spaces are being filled by water. Okay, and now we're getting an internal pressure on these PEDs. Okay, as that pressure becomes great, we start to slake. So here's my PED with no diversity, no covers, no livestock integration. Here's my PED that has those things that probably you would say more reflect pre-European farming landscape, okay? But putting the principles back that were in place at that time, okay? And so if we start to look at this and we start to see that pressure come in there, we still are having oxygen bubbles come to the top. So we have a pretty healthy functioning soil right here that is basically holding in place. We have some real pressure occurring on this one here. We'll see how long it lasts. And as that pressure creates that internalness, it continues to slake. As it slakes, you can see the water quality starts to deteriorate as well. And what I always encourage people to do, take some soil PEDs out of your garden. If you have a farm, take them out of your cropland, take some out of your rangeland, your hayland, the orchard, and dry them. And then go ahead, you have to eat a lot of cheese balls to get these containers, but I took the hit and I ate them all. And so you got to do that, but get a little mesh and get some containers, dry them on a windowsill for a week or so, turn them now and then, make sure they're very dry. If they're not dry, it will offset that pressure. So when the water tries to come in, that water that's already in there will just offset, and there'll be no slaking, even if it is, not a very good soil. So then the question becomes this. Obviously, this one is struggling really bad. If this was in a rainstorm, we would have water erosion going down the hill pretty bad. Okay, and it's not just soil. You know, it's all the nutrients as well. It's the phosphorus, it's the nitrogen, etc. So it's not just soil. Oh, and you're not done. You have one more item. So take a look at the surface of these two containers and describe them for me, just on the surface.
This one's frothy, bubbly. This is clear.
Okay, what do you think's happening?
I would say that there's some chemical reaction going on here.
Yeah, some reaction going on. Thank you. What we basically have happening here is we're starting to see the glomalin come to the surface, the glues, also nitrogen, proteins, etc. It's all in here. The soil is just giving that up. Okay, and so those of you that are old enough can remember back in the summer fallow days, if you will, in this state, you could drive down a road after a rain, and the water was coming off of a summer fallow field, and it was hitting a road ditch, and there was a culvert, and it was swirling, waiting in line to go through the culvert. Okay, and what was on top of that swirl? Yeah, foamy froth. Okay, so in other words, the glomalin coming off of that field, and then when you had that action of the water swirling, brought it right to the surface, and you'd get a foot of foam or so boiling on top. Okay. Okay, so it lasted a little longer than I thought it might. It did okay. This is what we don't want to happen in our fields, in our nurseries, or anywhere else. We want to get a strong soil that will handle and be able to store water as well. Okay, and so in the first half of my career, I spent my summers building sod waterways, grass waterways. And I spent most of my summers in this county building those waterways. When I look back at it now, most of them weren't needed. We just needed to change our management and be able to get the water into the profile. And once we got the water into the profile, that's a whole different scenario. And so you can kind of see with an illustration like this. So I encourage anyone to go ahead and put some PEDs together on their own operation, their own garden. You know why we don't do more of this, don't you? Through USDA, you know why we don't do more of it? Just doesn't cost enough. Yeah. No, that's just humor, okay? It's just humor. All right, okay? Some of you are just so serious. It's just a little humor. I think if it was 50, 100, 500 bucks a pop, I think we'd be lining up. Okay. Is there a clicker, Eric, or otherwise I'm good with this too? Okay, not a problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to start in now next a little bit on the carbon cycle, and then we're just going to ease right into some actual soil health principles, and hopefully have a little bit of time. 9:45, Eric? Okay, I'm good with that. So let's talk about some things. Terms. I've worked 35 years for USDA, 30 of them right here in Burleigh County. And so I went back 30 years and I looked at the USDA outreach terminology. I looked at their terminology. And from 85 to 92, we used the term conservation tillage very frequently. And conservation tillage, I never liked the term because it was always way more about tillage than it was conservation. So I never really liked that term because I never felt it sent a good message. Okay, so we use that term from 85 to 92 on all of our workshops and our tours and demos, that type of thing. Then from 93 to 05, we used the term no-till. Never really liked that term. I thought it was too confining, too restrictive, too focused on one item. There's a much broader principle here in terms of soil health. And so disturbance is just one of those items. So from 93 to 05, that's pretty much the term that we used. And we started using the term soil health on the actual flyers that came out on 2006 on. And I like that term much better because it encompassed so much more. It encompasses all the soil health principles you see on the left side of the screen. It wasn't just the seeding operation. And so it was a much better scenario. When we moved into Coming out of conservation tillage, moving into no-till, USDA had some posters in the office, and there was an hourglass, and there was some change and some paper money on this poster. And the message to the farming community was, you want to move into no-till because it will save you time and money. It talked nothing about carbon. It talked nothing about building soil aggregates. It talked nothing about infiltration. It didn't have any of these principles. Nothing about nutrient management, water cycle, carbon cycle. It was time and money. So you can see where the thought pattern was at that time. Okay. In North Dakota, we export a lot of carbon, and we have a long history of it. When the early settlers gathered up the buffalo bones and took them to a railroad depot, probably one of their first monetary sources, but also soil organic matter in terms of our early farming practices, which were the best information at the time. So we are in an export business. Agriculture is a carbon export business. We have to balance out that with bringing in new carbon. Coal and oil, of course, have been with us for some time. So North Dakota, old sunshine carbon, okay, for many years. We had to start changing our thinking and learn how to put new carbon, new sunshine into the soil, into our farming practices. That, to me, was really essential. So this, Dr. Don Rykowski is kind of a mentor of mine. I work with him on carbon. And he explains that when we moved into the no-till systems, we slowed the release of CO2 into the atmosphere. We slowed it up, okay? But when we move into diversity with covers, then we start to put carbon back in as well. Okay, all the reducing of disturbance and going with the no-till system, really all that did was slowed the carbon loss. Okay, the other one actually adds carbon. So when you put the two together and you start to see some good impacts. Usually in production agriculture, we pretty much work in that upper left-hand side. Plant leaves have small openings in them called stomata, right? You remember your courses? You didn't miss that day in school, did you? You know, the small opening, the stomata. Into the stomata comes CO2. Okay, so carbon dioxide comes in, out of it, and we have the release of what? Oxygen and water vapor. Okay, now we got carbon in the plant. So you look at where it says atmosphere, okay, that's where the CO2 is. From the atmosphere, it goes into the vegetation through the stomata. Now it's in the plant. The plant's also going to give it off as exudate or a sugar into the soil to attract the biology. These are the people that build the aggregates and the glues that hold the soil together. Okay. Now the soil is going to release CO2 again through respiration. And we got CO2 going back into the atmosphere. Now we got the cycle, right? Now you got the carbon cycle. That's a quick abbreviation of it, but I was assured this is an extremely intelligent group. I'm just funning with you now. So now we got CO2 going back into the atmosphere, out of the soil, and now we have the complete cycle. So consequently, if we have less leaving than what came in, we're going to go ahead and have a little increase in our color. And we're going to have a little extra carbon. Carbon is food. Always, whenever you hear carbon, think food. We want a root mass to look like this. Thank you. Appreciate it. We want a root mass to look like this. We want to be able to see soil aggregates on that root mass. Okay. When you have that occurring, if that plant would have came up with white roots, nothing on it, not necessarily a good sign. You want soil aggregates stuck on there. You want that positive gluing concept. This is where soils are built, right there. That's where they start. Okay. If you take a look at the carbon scenario, a typical green plant is going to be about 42% carbon. Okay, so there's a lot of carbon in a green plant. Okay, so that's a good start. Above the ground and below the ground, in addition to the exudates. So about 42% carbon. We know that it's not just plants, it's diversity of plants that make the soil food web stronger. So if you take a look in Nature and Property of Soils is one of our major textbooks in the university system in North Dakota and a lot of other states as well. There's a section in there that I found really helpful. Type and diversity of organic residues added to a soil can influence the type and diversity of organisms that make up the soil community. So what are they saying? At noon today, if you just eat broccoli, nothing else, and then this evening, you just eat broccoli, tomorrow morning you get up and you just eat broccoli, next noon, next evening, you just eat broccoli, versus your friend who's eating a balanced meal, how many days before one of you is very ill and one of you is healthy? And it's a lot like that with a living organism. If we can feed it a balanced diet, different crop types, that's different exudates in terms of the different diversity of plants, and it makes a stronger food web. You can see it kind of visually here. The soil on your right has had, these are both no-till soils, but the soil on the right has had very little diversity, no covers, no livestock. Soil on the left you can see is darker, and the soil on the left has had the covers, livestock integration during the winter, that type of thing. Twice as much carbon is stored in the soil than in the world's vegetation and atmosphere combined. Now, I spent 30 years of boots on the ground just in this county. When I would go to a farm and I would go into the native rangeland and I'd take a soil sample, and I want to determine the soil organic matter level. And then on the same farm, I go to the cropland and I take an average of the cropland. Generally speaking, I'm going to have half or less the soil organic matter on the cropland that I have on the rangeland. Okay? Half or less. So in 125 years of farming, we've lost a good half or better of our soil organic matter. So to put it in perspective for you. So do we have room to sequester more carbon? We got tons of room. We got all kinds of it. Okay? We got all kinds of it. We have to put the methodology in place so we have less leaving than what's coming in. Okay. Plants take in the CO2 through the stomata. We just talked about that. Oxygen, water vapor are returned. Part of the carbon is used to grow the plant. Part is used as an exudate to attract the biology. Okay. Once you attract the biology, they do their processes. Now they're all together right by the plant, big guys and little guys together. What happens in the jungle when the big guys and the little guys are together? Big guys eat the little guys, and they're going to excrete the excess nutrient in a plant usable form. Now we're talking mineralization. You remember that day in class? Went over mineralization. So that's basically what it is. Okay? The process of converting from organic to inorganic plant available. CO2 released back into the atmosphere, primarily from the soil food web, roots, residue, anything with carbon in it that respires. Okay? It goes back. This is a natural process. Here's some of the issue that we've had in terms of carbon. If you look on the left side, CO2 loss from soil is accelerated by tillage and cropland, and the intake is restricted due to lack of a cover crop use. So we're accelerating the release, and we have no way to bring carbon back in on that field. Got to have a plant. There's an old saying in agronomy and conservation, plants fix soils. It's an oversimplification, but without a plant, you can't bring in carbon. And on the right side, you can see those different grass beds there. Two of them are real short, two of them are real long. The two that are real short on the left, that kind of defines the first half of my career. Not totally understanding the concept and what we needed to do in our grazing systems, okay? And the two on the right more defines my second half of my career, is understanding we got to have some leaf length here to harvest sunlight and CO2. Those can work together. So plants transfer carbon into the soil, exudates from growing roots. They slough this. If we use animals, let's see if you agree with this. If you have a plant and the plant goes to maturity, you harvested X amount of carbon. Okay? How can we do that over again but get more carbon out of that plant? That's where animals come in. Because when the animal comes in and he grazes off the top third, for example, the root mass shortens in the soil. Okay, there's a sloughing. That root mass is 58% carbon by weight, so now you're dropping food in a very low part of the profile. You can build your soils deep. You can see that without livestock and this planet, there would be a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere than there is today. So the CO2 issue is really critical. Think of carbon in this term. About a third of the carbon in the grain, about a third is in the residue, about a third is in the root mass. Okay? So that's kind of some good concepts to kind of keep in mind, about a third, and a third. That third in the grain is kind of for food. If the other 2/3 can go to the soil, we're in business. Okay? But that doesn't always happen. The other day I was driving down the highway, this was about 6 weeks ago. I went past fields that were just being combined, the wheat was just being combined. That's not a problem. That's our third for food, right? But then I went a little further and the straw was baled. Then I went a little further and it was combine baled and tilled. Then I've kind of lost all 3/3. That's an issue. That's a food supply for the biology that makes everything function. Makes the water cycle function. It directly starts to impact disease. It's the carbon cycle. It's all these items together. Okay, this is an important item. Is carbon important to others? You know, this was in the Tribune in November of 14. 23 landowners signed carbon deals with Chevrolet that fall. I think that's an indication, in North Dakota, that's an indication that others are starting to have a better grasp, I think, on carbon as well, and the importance of it and the management of it. Okay. So let's move into some principles. We'll talk briefly on these 5 items. Okay. Let's start with armor. Does that field have any armor? No. When I walk on that field, it's like walking on concrete. That field has been compressed. Okay. So it doesn't have pore spaces in it. Okay. This is what a little more what I like to see. I like to see some armor on the surface. This is what takes, when it rains, we compact bare soils. The force of rainfall compacts bare soils. So if we have residue on the surface, we're in the game. Disturbance. This is a first year gentleman that I'm working with. This is a first year no-till field. Can you see the horizontal compaction layers? Yeah, this is where the pore spaces are taken out. The minerals pressing together. Okay, so it restricts. You can see the horizontal root mass. You can see the roots going horizontal, coming out of those plates. I want to change that. I want to build aggregates in there. Our trend in conservation has been toward less tillage. Okay, but we're not there yet. When we look at the landscape and we see those light hilltops, what's happened there? We've washed out the topsoil or the carbon. Okay, it's now somewhere else. Right? So that's something that we want to take a look at. Erosion is not controlled. You've driven down the various highways in North Dakota, or were you out? Was it a week ago? We had the big windstorm. Was that about a week ago? Did you get a chance to drive around a little that day? Probably best if you didn't. Yeah, you wouldn't have liked what you saw. So we need to take a look at these principles again. How do we reduce tillage? How do we bring more carbon in? How do we secure these soils? Diversity, we talked about this, all 4 major crop types. It's not just a plant. Got to have diversity of plants to do this. So if your goal, I've always had this, when a farmer would drive up to the office and on his license plate it would say wheat, I'd always go, oh God, this is going to be a tough day. We got 1 crop type and the other 3, we don't even want to talk about it. It takes diversity of plants to do this, just like in the original landscapes. Okay, you can start to see we're healing. You can see the compaction layers on both fields here. This is at the Minokan farm just east of Bismarck, where I do a bit of my work. You can see where we're starting to make an impact on the left side. Diversity. That takes diversity of plants. It takes covers. Cover crops extend your period of time to harvest CO2 and sunlight. And they secure a nutrient that otherwise would go elsewhere. Nitrous oxide into the atmosphere, which is way more damaging per unit than CO2. So if we have that nutrient after harvest in a plant, catch and release, we're in business. Okay, covers and livestock. These are just some farms I work with here, all within an hour drive of Bismarck. This particular farm, multi-species cover crop, right after their triticale vetch harvest. Then it goes into a multi-species cover, probably 8 species on the average. Now you're bringing diversity into a cropping system. Okay. Then they can integrate livestock that fall or that winter. Okay. So that allows us to put why do we want livestock on the land? Yeah, organic matter, also the biology, both. We've got 3 pounds of biology inside of us that digests. The rumen has biology in it that digests. The soil has biology in it that digests. And so we bring these livestock on, and the biology is going to be in their milk foam. When the calf is drinking, it's going to be in the manure, the urine, the hooves. We need the biology back on the soil as well. Okay. Let's look at the biology. This is on the same farm. When I have high crop diversity with covers, you can look at the total biology in the top by weight. That's about 2,000 nanograms per gram. When I don't have covers in there, what happens? There's less biology. In the past, in civilizations of people, what happened when they had a lot of food supply? That civilization would do pretty well, and it would grow. What happened when they didn't have a reliable food supply? They were usually taken over by their neighbors. Yeah. What happens to our nutrient? This is the same farm. I want you to take a look here. This is high crop diversity with covers. So you see the part right by the blue arrow, it says inorganic nitrogen, that's the plant available, and the organic nitrogen, that's what's in the soil organic matter coming for release. So if you look at the inorganic, it's fairly small, 18 units. That's the plant available one, that's the volatile one, nitrous oxide, that's the one that's going to denitrify or nitrify. Okay? So what happens when we take the covers out? He's got parts of the farm that don't have a cover. What happens to the nitrogen? Now all of a sudden the inorganic N is up around 40 some pounds and the organic N is much lower. Covers secure, catch and release. They catch and release nitrate nitrogen. This is positive for the environment and especially for water quality. All these items. Here's one I didn't see coming. We got some people that are putting full season cover crops on instead of just after harvest. These are full season cover crop planted in June. Warm season mix planted in June. That winter it's grazed. After half of it is grazed, because the other half is for the soil biology, then he brought in hay and he fed on these acres. And then an old conservationist like myself comes along and I monitor it. And I'll take a look at what's happening. So if you look at what's happening in terms of carbon is to me one of the big ones. A wheat stubble field with no livestock impact, 239 parts per million. A cover crop, where the cover crop was planted when the cattle were not fed on, was 300, and wherever the cattle were fed, it jumped up to 325. Plus it became more nutrient rich. So you start to see some impacts that we can do with livestock in today's monitoring. Blackleg Ranch, also in Burleigh County. High crop diversity covers. The ranch plants about 700 acres of cover crops a year. And I can paraphrase this for you. When we planted them back to back, on the right side, you can see the 3312 nanograms, high biology count. When we come back to a monoculture on the left side, it drops down to about 1774 or about half. So when we bring in high plant diversity, what happens to the biology? It goes up. When you come back with a monoculture, what happens to the biology? It comes down. Okay? That's an oversimplification, but that's the process. This is one of the mixtures. So you can see it's got good diversity of crop types. Okay? Also on the ranch, I take a look at the nitrogen cycle and I compare it to other farms and ranches in the county. You can see the trend here. Native rangeland is the first three. Okay, this is native rangeland, small, Berg, Winkler. You see the low inorganic number, small little inorganic number of nitrogen. That's the plant available part. It operates with a slow release. But then take a look at the right. Take a look at the organic nitrogen. That's what's going to mineralize now. You can see a very large number. We need to mimic that in our cropland. And so what's happened where the cover crops are being used on Black Lake Ranch? Very similar. Now the inorganic is becoming a small number, and the organic becomes a larger number. Now we aren't losing nitrogen. Now we're securing it. Okay. Oh, there we are. 20 yearlings. We grazed 20 yearlings on 12 acres, and I just had some things here I wanted to share with you. It's not lunchtime yet, is it? Huh? Or is it break? We're at one of the pastures at the Minokan farm. Livestock just moved out yesterday, so they've been out less than 24 hours. You can see evidence of dung beetles on this particular one. You can see their entries, and they play a role along with the mites. So we're just going to peel back a little bit and see if we can find somebody. There's one that we just saw. Look around a little bit more. There's one. We'll put him up on top here. There he goes. So we can kind of see him as he's traveling away from us. And he found another entry. There he is. We can kind of take a peek at him. And if they have a number of mites on them, they're much more effective. Okay, let's talk about that a second. When the dung beetle flies in, if he's got mites on him, and they land on a cow path, the dung beetle's interested in the dung. The mites are interested in the fly larvae. You heard the flies, right? So they're going to jump off, and they can carry up to a dozen mites. They're going to jump off, and they're going to go after the fly larvae. Okay, that makes a cooperative working agreement that has been really effective. And so all the work in the world that's been done is if you don't have dung beetles, first of all, you aren't going to have much decomposition there. That's a major item. If you don't have mites in the dung beetle, then you're only operating at 50% strength too. Okay. So we graze these, bringing livestock back onto the landscape. Okay. And when we graze them, they typically, these 20 yearlings and 3 sheep, typically get 1 acre at a time. Okay. So with single wire electric, they'll get 1 acre at a time. Single wire electric's once the animals are trained, it's tremendous. It's like a wedding ring, right? Get that? Single wire electric and a wire ring and a wedding ring. Neither one stops anything from happening. It's psychological, right? It's just I'm just funning with you. It's okay. It's okay. But there is a strong correlation. Minokan farm, 95% ground cover. That's critical. Got to have ground cover. Soils are not meant to be bare. They're meant to be covered. Okay. So the ground cover is a monitoring tool. This is what one of the paddocks looked like just a few hours after the livestock were moved out. Okay. What do you see? What do you see in addition to the livestock grazing a warm season cover mix here? You can see the birds and the plant diversity on the birds. Yeah, cowbirds, part of a grazing community. Okay, that's a healthy landscape. If you go out and you see cowbirds on a herd, there's something happening there. There's food there. Okay. This is what it looked like when we had them in the cool season mix. I'm stressing these plants to let them regrow to harvest additional CO2. And then I'll monitor them. Okay. Now on the other side, I'm mimicking livestock. All right. Let's see if we can This is crop rolling. I'm going to crop roll this cover like the livestock would walk it to the surface. Okay? It's just a crimper. There's a crimper bars on a roller. Let's buffer a little. There you can kind of get a look at the bar at the end there. And then I said, well, okay, that rolled it down, but that provided no biology. So then for this comparison, we said, well, let's put on about 9 to 10 tons of compost. So we came back to mimic the biology end of it that the livestock can do. Okay? So then we're going to put on some compost. Compost doesn't have much for a lot of nutrient in it. It might be 1% nitrogen, depending on how you made it, but a lot of biology. Okay, so we're adding some biology here. And I'll do the carbon analysis this year and next year on these fields. But my point is, we're going to do a lot of work here for what the cows can do for us, if they have legs. The biggest issue is our livestock no longer have legs. Drive across this country, what are you going to see? You won't see livestock. They're in confinement. We need to put the legs back on these critters. When we do that, positive things happen. Okay. This is my closing. Because the green just went up. Okay. Went a little fast here. Let's see if I can back that up. Governor signed a soil health proclamation in 2013, and so I'm sure you all remember that. That was a positive thing. Okay. So soil health proclamation, appreciated that. Find ways to increase soil organic carbon and soil health will follow. That's the thought I want to leave you with today. I think that's a real positive item. Also some books. These are ones that I've used in the past. I got a lot of others, but Nature and Property of Soils. When I was in college, it was the 7th edition. Now it's 14th. So I got the 1st, the 7th, and the 14th at my desk. Okay. First one is in stone tablets. Journals of Lewis and Clark, that's kind of a no-brainer. Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden, really helpful to mimic that type of system. One Straw Revolution, Managing Cover Crops Profitably. Jared Diamond's always good for the mind. Soil Biology Primer. Life in the Soil is a good one too. There's 2 to 3 pages in everything that's alive. And so if you read that book, you can go to the specific item you want to read about and read the 2-3 pages. Or if you have no life, you can read the entire book, which I've done, and it's really good. An Agricultural Testament by Sir Albert Howard. How could somebody who wrote a book in 1940 describe the predicament we're in 2015? How did he do that? He exactly describes what we're up against. I'm going to leave you with that because we got 3 minutes or so, or a few minutes. We got a few minutes for any questions if anybody has any. Oh, and I appreciate being able to come today to visit with you. That to me is important. I think we need to speak for the resource. There is no cutter, canner, cookie business way to do this. This is something that follows principles, okay? And I'm not a purist in terms of how I get there. At the end of the day, what I like to look at is, did I bring in more carbon? Did I have less carbon leave than what I brought in? That's what I kind of want to take. Did I gain in carbon? Because if I gained in carbon, you did something right. That's a real positive thing. And I think that's where we really should be looking at.
Thank you, Jake.
Thank you, folks.